bridge collapsed. The mountain road washed out. All the signs are obscured by fog. Your only directions are detours. Eventually it dawns on you. Sometimes you need to get lost to discover where you're supposed to be. Welcome to Merlin's Barn.
Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Merlin's Barn. Of course, I say evening, that's when I'm recording, but it could be morning, could be afternoon, could be Happy New Year. I don't know, whenever you're listening to it. And I was thinking tonight, as I'm getting a record of different stories that I have on my list, and then I thought what would be really fun would be to take a little detour and talk about Volkswagens, because I have so many weird stories and adventures because of Volkswagens. And we're not talking about the new Volkswagens with all the whiz bangs and all the electronics and everything in them. No, we're talking about the old ones, the ones that were designed before World War II, the ones that the Germans had in World War II, the ones that they started bringing into the U.S. in the 1950s, the ones that became that symbol of the counterculture movement in the 1960s, for the hippies, the buses, the Beatles, their little simple four-cylinder air-cooled engines. My first car was a Volkswagen Beetle, and that all started with saving up money. And when I was about 10 or 11, I got a newspaper route in Massachusetts, and there was an apartment complex and a bunch of houses at the bottom of our street. My father made these heavy-duty steel racks that hung off of either side of my 10-speed bicycle. Yes, 10-speed, back before we came up with all those other speeds. I also had a 3-speed that was his from when he was a kid. It was from like 1956, and that was what I had instead of an antique car back then. I was really into old cars since I was a little kid. So I delivered newspapers for about 3 years, and then summers would go to a summer camp and eventually became a counselor there. I saved up this money. And the initial idea was to take that money and put it towards college. And in the end, I think we only had about $2,000 saved up before my family moved to Maryland. So when I was sophomore year of high school, I was still going to high school in Massachusetts, and my family moved to Maryland. And I boarded there for half a year, came down to Maryland, and started going to high school. And was 17, got my driver's license finally, and started to look into my first car because we realized that $2,000 wasn't going to make a big dent towards college. And that'd be good if I had an automobile so I could drive to school, because we lived out in Hunt Valley, Maryland, and the school was down in Baltimore. And so we started looking, and my dad sort of went along with my desire to have an antique car, and we looked at different 40s cars, and he got very worried about what we'd be getting into, especially with the fact that I had no knowledge of anything on antique cars. And he finally says to me, he says, you're going to learn everything, or almost everything, you need to know about cars on the Volkswagen Beetle. Because the wonderful thing about Volkswagen Beetles is they're insanely simple. Almost everything can be fixed with just a handful of wrenches. You can fix things simply to get them going to where you need to go if something breaks. And he learned everything, really most of what he knew about cars, on something very similar, which was his 1956 Porsche. This is a car that he bought in 1965, and there will be other stories. Hopefully I'll get a chance to interview him and have him tell his stories about that car. But the old 50s Porsches were very similar in design to a Volkswagen Beetle. In fact, they even sort of looked like a Beetle that an elephant had stepped on. Engine very similar but souped up. And the neat thing is you could take that engine out in about 20 minutes. Of course, he didn't know that at first, so he bought his first Porsche in Malden, Massachusetts for about $500, drove it home to his college, and By the time he got back to college in, I think it was Troy, New York, it was running on 1 out of 4 cylinders. And his parents were going to come and visit in about a week, and he realized that they would kill him if they found out that he'd spent this money on a car that wasn't working. So he, being an engineering student, he went and designed tools to do a valve job on this car with the engine in it. And I think said he spent 24 to 30 hours just without sleep working on this car to get it ready for his parents to see when they came up to the college. And when he's towards the end of the job, one of his fraternity brothers comes out, and Dad is very proudly showing him the tools that he's made to do this job. And his fraternity brother looks at him and says, "Dick, do you know that it only takes about 20 minutes to take the engine out of that car?" And Dad just stares at him. And all of the lack of sleep and everything catches up with him. And he just looks at him and says, "Why couldn't you tell me this a day ago?" Because he'd spent all this time doing the impossible with home design tools, and he could have had it done in an afternoon. But he learned, and he learned a lot. And he still has that car to this day. And before people get too excited, it's rather battered, but he has it. He continually says, "I think I can get my money back out of that. It'll never get sold. I mean, I'll get it, then the nephews will get it or something." So he convinced me that my first car should be a Volkswagen Beetle. So we got off the track of looking at different weird antique cars that we'd never be able to get parts for, and started looking for Beetles, and eventually found one. We lived down in Hunt Valley, Maryland, and there was a fellow in Hunt Valley, lived down on a horse farm. He had rented an apartment attached to one of the big barns, and he had a Volkswagen Beetle, and it was, I think, $1,600. So we drove down, we took a look at it. Dad test drove it because I didn't know how to drive stick at that point. Had a nice crank open sunroof. Talked him down to $1,500 and got it home. And then I taught myself stick shift, driving back and forth in the driveway, which apparently was hilarious to some of my parents' friends who remembered me as a child just riding in circles in their driveway on my bicycle as I figured it out. And eventually started driving back and forth to school, and I became known for my little red Volkswagen Beetle. I took that to college with me. And these would eventually be things that later in college I would make money to pay rent by just watching for Volkswagen Beetles on farms in southern Maryland. I went to St. Mary's College. And I'd pick up Beetles for a couple $100 and fix them up and resell them for $1,500 and have money for rent and food and stuff for the next couple months. And my little Beetle, I had a bunch of tools in the front trunk. It was a super Beetle, so they have bigger trunks than the regular Beetles. And so I could always fix it when it broke down, which was often. And my first story is going to be my my girlfriend, who would become my first wife. She and I decided to go and visit a friend one weekend. And we drove up from St. Mary's. And as we're heading up towards Bowie, Maryland, the car gets louder and louder and louder, to the point where people are veering away from us in traffic. And I finally pull over at a Friendly's, which is now I think it's a Mexican restaurant or something in Bowie, and climb out and look, and I can see that there's about 3 or 4 inches of the exhaust pipe missing between the heater box, because there's the little boxes that wrap around the exhaust pipes that warm up from the hot exhaust pipe and push heat into your car, and sometimes work. And the pipe comes through that and continues up to the muffler. Well, mine was missing about 3 or 4 inches before the muffler. And I looked at my girlfriend and I said, if I had some hose clamps and some tin snips and a piece of tin, I could fix this. I started digging through the trunk of the car, and I found, for some reason, I had tin snips in there from working on somebody's house. And I found I had hose clamps. So I decided, I was like, you know what? I'm going to go into Friendly's and ask them if I can have a big tin can. And I've always dressed vest, pocket watch, fedora. So they get me walking in their vest, pocket watch, fedora, large Russian overcoat because it was cold. And I walk up to the counter. The young lady at the counter says, "Can I help you, sir?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, I don't need a table. I'm not ordering anything. I said, "My car broke. It's very loud. And what I need is a food storage container, a big tin can, the biggest tin can you have, so I can cut it up and fix my car. And she goes, oh, I can find you that. And she disappears in back. And she's back there doing her thing, and the manager comes up to the counter and looks at me. He sort of stares at me. He says, can we help you, sir? I said, no, no, no. I said, the young lady, she's the girl, she's in back, and she pops up and waves this giant mandarin orange container. And she goes, is this good? I was like, that's absolutely perfect. Thank you. And he looks at her, and then he looks at me, and he goes, okay. And he keeps staring at me, and she goes and rinses it and brings it up to the counter. And she says, here you go. I said, do I owe you anything? She goes, no, no, no. I said, this is absolutely perfect. This will fix my car. This is great. Thank you so much. And I looked at the manager. I said, thank you so much. You've really helped. He sort of stares at me, and he doesn't know what to make of me. And he definitely doesn't know what to make of a guy who's really ridiculously excited over a tin can, a mandarin orange food storage container tin can. And just looks at me and says, we're very glad we could help you, sir. And walks off. So I think I confused him for the evening. I went out to the car, and I got my tin snips out, and I cut up the can, and I wrapped it around a few times to make a really solid pipe, tightened the hose clamps around it. I think that mandarin orange food storage container was on the car when I sold it 3 or 4 years later. So that's our first little Volkswagen story of the evening. There will be so many more of these that will appear because so many adventures, detours, things that have happened involved some Volkswagen Beetle or Volkswagen bus. And that's where we come into the Volkswagen bus. And I fell in love with the Beatles. And then I got to know Volkswagen buses, which are essentially these large, glorious, cute Twinkies on 4 wheels with a tiny engine in the back that just sort of hopes to propel them to a useful speed. And I fell in love with them by going to a show that was called The Bug Out in Manassas, which was twice a year I would go to this thing. And back in the 90s, it was such a big thing, and it was so cool. And you could just, the first time I was going to it, I didn't even know where I was going. You got to think, this is back before we had GPS on our phones. This is back before we had cell phones. Back when we had to hike 5 miles uphill both ways through snow, fighting brontosaurus to get to school. I think pizza had been invented at that point, though, so at least we had pizza. So I drove towards Manassas, and not knowing where I was going, and eventually 11 Volkswagen Beetles come just shooting by me. They must have been souped up engines and stuff. And I sped up, and I caught up to them, and I fell in with them, and that's how I found the Bug Out. And you could just find it that way. Just head out in your Beetle, and you would find other Beetles. And it was a lot like the Jeep culture nowadays, where when the Jeep Wranglers see each other, people wave at each other. If you saw another Volkswagen Beetle, you waved, gave the peace sign, whatever. It was fun. You're part of this group. And at the Bug Out, I got to see all the different bugs and the Volkswagen buses. And the buses are neat. The neatest of all the buses were the camper conversions. These were made by Westphalia. And they're essentially Swiss Army knives. They have a top that pops up. So the older ones, you've just got a cot up there. You've got a big window, screen window you can zip open. With the top popped up, you can stand up and walk around inside. The later ones, you had like a double bed up on the top, and you had a bed downstairs that went over the engine. You had a nice little kitchenette with 2 bench seats and a table that would fold down so you could make another bed there. You had a sink and an ice box, place to put your stove that folded out from the side. They were Swiss Army knives, and I wanted one. And when I was in college, a friend said to me one day, he said, you need to drive down this road because there's 2 Volkswagen buses for sale in this guy's yard. And so I went for a drive one afternoon after class and drove down this side road and found this property with an orange Volkswagen camper and a red Volkswagen bus parked next to each other. And a couple of those little Hondas from the late 60s, early 70s that look like sneakers. It almost must fit like sneakers. They're so small I can't figure out how humans get in them. And the buses had for sale signs in the window. And I knocked on the door, and the fellow came out, tall, skinny fellow, older, long gray beard, wearing old mechanics coveralls. And we're talking about the buses, and he says, well, the orange one ran, but I did this, and I did this. He says, I'll make you a deal on the pair of them. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with 2 Volkswagen buses. But I desperately wanted the camper. So I scrounged up $600 in the next couple of days and gave it to him and had it towed over to a friend's house. And then went home for Christmas and told my dad about the Volkswagen bus that I bought that I was going to fix up. And he immediately started going through his head my limited knowledge of vehicles and that I'd probably gotten myself in over my head. And so he comes down to St. Mary's with me and takes a look at the bus. We end up taking the engine out of the bus and putting it in his station wagon, and he takes that home. And we go back and we fuss with that, and then he decides the bus should just be towed to their house and put in the garage where he and I will get it back on the road. That was an adventure in itself because I took tags from another car, illegally put them on the Volkswagen bus, and then AAA lost the bus. How you lose a bright orange rusty Volkswagen bus is beyond me, but it happened because they picked it up. They got it partway towards Baltimore and their truck broke down and they left it in a supermarket parking lot. And they called me and told me about that. They said, we're going to pick it up tomorrow morning. I said, okay. I don't hear anything. I get around 4 o'clock the following day and I call them up and I say, where's the Volkswagen bus? Oh, we delivered it. Where did you deliver the Volkswagen bus to? Because it's not here. Hunt Valley Auto Repair. I said, I don't even know of a shop called that. And so I go look at the phone book. I said, there isn't a shop called that. They said, oh, that's where the truck driver said he left it. I said, he didn't leave it at this address where we told you to send it? And the guy on the phone says, I'm going to check. We might have just lost the bus. So I'm in a panic for the next hour, and they find that no, a second truck had broken down, and the mechanic had towed it somewhere else and not told them, and just told them a story. So they send a third truck out to find my bus, and it finally shows up later that night at my parents' house, and we push it into the garage. And at that point, I learned more about Volkswagen engines and disc brakes, and it was definitely a learning experience. Probably shouldn't have bought it, but we got it going. I drove it back to the college and had that thing for a couple of years, and it was beautiful. I would take it down to Point Lookout State Park. There's this causeway that the Chesapeake Bay comes up to, and then there's sort of pond going out to and marsh going out to the Potomac on the other side. And so my girlfriend and I would park it on the causeway, open up the little jalousie windows on the side, pop the top, and we'd sit there for the afternoon just with this beautiful Chesapeake Bay breeze flowing through it, working on our assignments, reading our assignments, writing, etc., etc. And that was fantastic. So we had it for a couple of years, and it in the cold weather eventually developed this weird problem where it would suck its gas pedal to the floor and start accelerating to speeds that no Volkswagen bus was ever designed to accelerate to. And you'd have to reach down and yank up the pedal, and then it would hopefully slow down. And honestly, I never figured out what caused this. In warm weather, it never happened. So one winter weekend, we decided to go visit our friend Scott up in New Jersey. And the Beetle was having issues. So we usually would, at that point, we lived in an apartment above a garage, and we had like the row of Volkswagens out in front. You'd go out and pick which Volkswagen was having the least issues that day to drive somewhere. So we chose the Volkswagen bus, and it was cold, and heat in a Volkswagen bus is an interesting thing. And if you know Volkswagen buses, you're sitting here giggling at this point because you know the problem, which is there's this little 4-cylinder engine in the back with these heater boxes that, as I described on the Beetle, take the heat off of the exhaust pipe. And then the blower in the engine is supposed to push this heat up a long, thin tube to the front of the vehicle where it's going to flow out of the vents and warm you up. Well, especially on a 25-year-old Volkswagen bus that hadn't been well maintained, that doesn't work well, if at all. So I had like one little heater ceramic thing that plugged into the cigarette lighter, and that was about it. So we wrapped ourselves up I mean, I had my usual vest, pocket watch. I had a scarf reminiscent of what Tom Baker wore in the early Doctor Who's. I had a long, I had a long Russian overcoat on. I had German World War II Eastern Front issue boots that were wool felt. I had my fedora on, and just to finish this all off, I had fluffy mutton chop side whiskers and hair down to my shoulders. And so we drive this up to New Jersey, freezing the entire way. I had my fingerless gloves on. We had the little ceramic heater blowing on us, barely keeping our nose from being frostbitten. We make it to New Jersey, and we spend a couple days hanging out with our friend up there, just exploring, working on things, eating good food. And when we go to head back, he very valiantly offered. He says to me, he says, the bus is freezing. I have a heated car. I don't mind driving to Baltimore with you all so that she can ride in heat. So why don't you take the bus and she can ride down with me? And I was like, that's great. That's fantastic. And thank God he did that because we leave and we're heading down 95 and it's so cold it starts doing the weird I'm going to suck my gas pedal to the floor and accelerate to ungodly speeds thing all over again. And the third time it terrifyingly does this. It accelerates up to around almost 80 miles per hour. And I'm flailing trying to get my hand down to the floor to pull up the gas pedal, and it's sticking. And I see a sign for the Delaware House rest stop. The Delaware House rest stop at the time was it was a round building with a round parking lot around it. So I just put my turn signal on, aimed for that. As I got close to the rest stop on the exit ramp, I cut the ignition, shut off the vehicle, and came flying into that parking lot, just coasting. Hit the brakes, stood it up in a parking lot spot, and then just sort of sat there and calmed down for a minute. My friend pulls in next to me in his old police car, gets out, and asks what's going on. And I said, I'm going to ride with you, and we're going to call AAA and get this taken down to Baltimore because I can't do that terrifying Mach 3 travel in an orange shoebox anymore. Then we're coming to the next thing. I've got to call AAA. I have an orange shoebox that has bright orange spots where I've fixed the rust on it. Got the nice white fiberglass top where the pop top is. And at a point, in a fit of whimsy, a friend of mine and I made stencils for it that were nuclear hazard signs, and that said Test Group 1, and stenciled those on the driver's side and passenger side door in flat black. Why? Because, well, we thought it was funny. So I go into the rest stop and call AAA, and the lady asked me about the bus and the year and the color and license plate. I give her those, and she said, "So you're going to be with the vehicle?" I said, "No, I'm freezing. There's a Roy Rogers in here with roast beef sandwiches and coffee, and I'm going to sit in here and wait for the truck to show up, and we're going to be warm." And she says, "Well, okay, if you're not going to be with it, are there any other identifying features on the bus?" And I swear she asked me this, and I'm sitting there like, it's an orange Volkswagen camper. What else do you need? And I said, well, it has nuclear hazard signs on the doors. She's quiet. She goes, okay. She said, if the driver needs to find you, and once again, got to remind folks, this is before cell phones, or before the average person had a cell phone. It's probably like mid 1990s, maybe like 96 or something. And she says, so if the driver has to find you, can you describe yourself for me? And this is just when I think it got too weird for AAA. I described what I've already described to you all wonderful listeners, that I'm wearing a fedora and a long scarf and a Russian overcoat and heavy felt boots, and I have mutton chop side whiskers and hair down to my shoulders. And so I'm describing this. She cups over the phone, and I can hear talking in the background. And then it's just quiet. And then she comes back. And I said to her, I do want to explain that I am freezing. There are three of us here. We do exist, and I am going to have a sandwich and sit by the window and wait for your truck. She goes, all right. She said, there'll be a truck there in 45 minutes. So we go over to Roy Rogers. We get our sandwiches. I've got my roast beef sandwich. I've got my hot fries. I've got my coffee. We sit down. at a seat by an outer window. My coffee has steam rising from it. The sandwich almost has steam rising from it. I go to take a bite of it, and I see a flatbed pull into the parking lot. Just past the bus. Somehow or other they didn't see it. Two people in it, they're looking every which way. I think that can't be. And they're driving slowly, and they're looking everywhere. I'm like, oh my God, is that our truck? So I run out the door and start running the opposite direction, and it passes me somehow or other. So I run and catch up with it, and when it stops within view of the bus. And I get a run up, and the guy looks out the window and stares at me for a full few seconds. And he rolls down the window, and he looks at me and he says, Jesus Christ, you do exist. I looked at him and I said, yes. He says, so there's a Volkswagen bus? I said, I pointed, I said, it's right over there. And he goes, oh. Then you can see him focusing on the doors, and he goes, are you hauling anything? I looked at him and I said, it's a rusty bus. No, those are a joke. I said, are you going to tow it? He says, no. He says, we thought you were a prank. We're the truck sent to see if you actually exist. He says, I'll call it in now, and the actual truck will come out in 45 minutes. I'm like, oh, okay. So I go back inside to my now lukewarm sandwich, my fries that are getting cold. Coffee was really hot, so there's still a little steam coming off of that. Eat my sandwich, gnaw on my cold fries, enjoy my coffee. About 45 minutes later, another flatbed truck pulls into the parking lot. A little bit past Volkswagen bus, so they don't see it. And we recreate the entire prior scene all over again, where I run out, they pass me, I catch up with them. He's not near the bus this time, but he sees me and he rolls down his window. And he stares for about 3 or 4 seconds. And then he says, Jesus Christ. I said, yes. He says, you do exist. I looked at him and I said, yeah, we established that the last time. He says, there's a Volkswagen bus? I said, yep. I said, if you go around the corner, you'll see it. He drives around and I catch up with him, and he's hyper-focused on the spray-painted flat black nuclear hazard signs on the doors. And he goes, are you hauling anything? And I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking about the same Jesus Christ conversation twice now. And I'm looking at the bus with glossier orange spots on it where I've repaired rust, with the spray-painted stencil on the doors. And I just looked at him and I said, it's clean this week. We haven't hauled anything for a month. Oh, okay then. So he loads it up, and I go inside, and I find my friends, and we go back out. And we follow him down to Baltimore. The wind's buffeting the Volkswagen bus as it's strapped down to his flatbed. I'm watching it bounce back and forth, just going, I'm okay with you falling off at this point if you want to. I'm sort of done with this whole thing. We took it down to her parents' house and left it there for about a month. And a month later, it was warm. Went up, picked it up, just didn't drive it in cold weather after that. Never had that weird problem again. So a couple of years later, this is one of the vehicles that I always regret selling, because I think to get another one would be like $15,000 to $35,000 now. And it's not for just the uniqueness of it, it's just for it was just a wonderful camper. But I got this bug up my butt and decided to sell the Volkswagen bus and buy a Corvair van, which that's an entire another story. And if you're a car person, you're just sort of laughing and wondering what's wrong with me at this point, which I wonder often, honestly. And so I put the bus up for sale in some of the local auto traders and stuff. And we're still in that apartment above a garage with the row of Volkswagens out in front. I had the bus out by the road. I had this fellow say he was going to come down and meet me around 7. He never showed up. I'm taking a shower. I get out of the shower. She comes up to me and she says, there is somebody in the bus with a flashlight out by the road. I was like, well, that's weird. It was like 9:30 at night now. So I put on my state park uniform, which looks a lot like a state trooper uniform, grab a big black mag light, and head down the steps. And I meet the Beanie Baby Man. I mean, this man was the Beanie Baby king. On top of that, as far as I could tell, from his build and his labored breathing. I think he made his living from selling Beanie Babies and eating bags, and he survived off of Burger King and Doritos. And he follows me wheezing up the steps to the apartment. I was afraid he wouldn't make it. There's Beanie Babies in his shirt pockets, in his pant pockets, in his back pockets. We sit down, and I'd asked for like 1,000. He talks me down to 900. That's fine. And he says that he's got 600 for me now. If I can hold on to it for another week, he's got some more Beanie Babies to sell, and he'll be back. And I said, that's fine. And I'm really worried for the next week, less about Beanie Baby sales, but more about the man's health. And sure enough, a week and a half later, he gets back to me, and he's been to a couple shows and sold more of those Beanie Babies. He shows up again a week and a half later with different Beanie Babies sticking out of his pockets and gives me the rest of the money and has a friend with him and tags it and drives it home. And that was the last I ever saw of the of the Volkswagen bus, was the Beanie Baby man driving away in it. That's a couple Volkswagen stories out of many, many, many. I hope sometime to get my dad and just interview him on the weird Porsche-related adventures and cross-country road trips and stuff that he took. And if I haven't mentioned it, he still has that car. He's working on it. He's working on it now. My former students and I got it running in 2010, and they have it. My parents have it back up in Massachusetts with them now. I think it's awesome when there's like a car in a family that has so many stories and so much family connection, and it stays in that family. There's something wonderful about that. I'll finish with saying, as always, thank you so much for listening and surviving my ramblings. And if you have stories, if you have adventures, if you have some Volkswagen stories, if you have interesting people you've met, detours you've gone on that took you to that quirky place in the woods that you've never been able to find since, send them to us so we can include them in future episodes. You can always contact us on Instagram at the Merlin's Barn account. That's MERLINSBARN. And if you want to send us something longer, the best bet is to send it to merlinsbarn@gmail.com. And once again, thank you all for listening. And have a wonderful rest of the week, and I'll be talking to you next week. Take care.